Okay, sorry for the delay. We are finishing up, I hope, um, or Elena Long reading today. We're looking at the first chapter of her book on value without fetish, Uno Kuzo's theory of pure capitalism in light of Marx's critique of political economy. The point of her work is situating the critique of the fetishism of the bourgeois relations of production, that's a mouthful, back into the critique of political economy. The point being is that certain scholars have decided in their own, for important reasons, to set aside certain questions, some of which can be called cultural, and are perhaps not as current in the terms of the overall development of Marx's thought in terms of commodity fetishism. Um, Others may think, in fact, the commodity fetishism issue is still a vibrant issue. In fact, on the cultural side, it is a kind of metabolic relation, with all due respect. So one shouldn't let it go, or should be cowed into it by a certain body of thought that tends to look at certain subjective or subjectivity elements. So what we're going to do is try and finish off the first chapter. I've included in today's posting the last chapter, or the next to last chapter, on the effect of Uno's work on non-Japanese thought. And it's a useful chapter because it does recapitulate some of the things from the first chapter and provides, I think, a way in which we can proceed forward. Remember that I've been doing this in the context of several other developments, parallel things that we've been doing, David Harvey, Anwar Sheikh, etc., and on certain viewpoints or standpoints on the issue of capital, or capital, the volume, and all in preparation for volume 3, that we hope will, I may even write a note to the lecture series to affirm that, and on volume 3 of Capital. And I think it's really important to consider that there is no one way of approaching this problem. It is, as they say, a multipolar problem, and one ever more important these days. So we're at 1.3.1, misunderstanding Marx. In his work, self-defined as the new or systematic dialectic, Chris Arthur, for example, insists that in the architecture of capital, the book, the pure forms of capital should be studied first, and especially the value form as the germ of capital, before its grounding in labor is analyzed. And this is, let me break here and say, this is a kind of systematic approach, and there shouldn't be anything problematic about that. Chris Arthur claims that the question of form is so crucial that the presentation starts with the form of exchange, bracketing entirely the question of the mode of production, if any, of the objects of exchange, 1 and 2. Arthur also thinks that Marx was unjustified in introducing the concept of abstract labor prematurely. Well, that's neither here nor there in some ways. Anyway, back to the text. It is notorious that Marx dives down from the phenomena of exchange value to labor as the substance of value in the first 3 pages of Capital. And people rightly complain that they do not find any proof there. So I argue that we must first study the development of the value form and only address the labor content when the dialectic of the forms itself requires us to do so. So, let me break here for a second and say, well, yeah, that's you can dichotomize it that way, but there's the point of form is not to bifurcate it into form and content. The whole question here is a structural one, and not one as if form was the container for content. Just to remind you of that, which hopefully should not be repeated. Arthur insists that for the analysis of capital, an absolute beginning without imposed conditions is needed. we will see how misinformed such a claim is as to the critical character of Marx's own method. Gert Rudin, remember we looked at Gert Rudin's work before, sings the same tune when he claims the value form of money as a constituent of value, and therefore begs the question, because we want to know precisely why it is that money represents value, why money can indeed buy all the other commodities. Now, surprisingly, Rudin does not seem to find it necessary to engage with Marx's analysis. Instead, he meanders in tautological clarifications and proofs of the dispensability of the concepts of abstract labor and substance based on word counts. Well, word counts, without getting into the reasons why you do a word count, that's not necessarily the reason. And if we did that, Kohei Saito would be in big trouble. Anyway, that rather served to obscure rather than illuminate the problem. This becomes especially telling when Rudin denounces Marx's concept of the substance of value in abstract labor as a mere metaphor. Yet, at no point in the text does he state what the substance of value is a metaphor for. At the same time, Rudin claims that the classics held a real embodiment of labor theory of value, of which a remnant existed in Marx. Marx was enmeshed in the physical substance-embodiment metaphor inherited from Hegel, that is, substance. And classical political economy, that is, embodiment. Number one, however, either labor as the substance of value is regarded as a mere metaphor, or it is indeed embodied in the commodity. See here we're tackling the congealment issue. But it cannot be both. It becomes all the more strange when Rudin concludes that Marx suffered from unclarity or a lack of clarity as to his own abstractions, a judgment more appropriate for Rudin's own argument. Rudin, therefore, not only misrepresents Marx's theory and is himself indeed unclear about Marx's straightforward fetishism-critical method, he goes on to explain that value has no existence prior to the market. You see, you already overdetermined the argument. This is indeed counterfactual to Marx's own analysis, as we shall see soon. In the same vein, the Marxist theorist of money and finance, Kostas Lapavitsas and Makoto Ito of the Uno school, see no reason to have to refer to abstract labor at all when they try to explain how money becomes the universal equivalent of exchange. Ito especially entangles himself in circularities and truisms when he tries to explain the money form without recourse to abstract human labor. Long before them, Uno Kuzo himself, as will be prominently discussed, has expressed a strict preference for form over substance in explaining the value forms, and thereby directly inviting a petitio principii. Quote, labor as value-forming substance abstracts from every form and is, so to speak, nothing more than something passive and abstract. As such, we cannot make it the foundation of value form. In other words, labor is developed by the value form in the first place. The value form of the commodity is rather grasped through the forms that this substance itself passes through, that is nothing else but the process of commodity economic development. However, the formal determination alone clarifies the fact of the assumption of the physical form and the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values, close quote. Regarding the analysis of the value form, two crucial interventions Marx aimed at go completely unnoticed or even rejected by these authors. Number one, the necessity of presupposing the totality of the capital relation from the beginning, in which the category of the commodity with which the analysis starts by no means signifies the simplest, but the most complex determination, a relation of totality. And number two, the function of value form analysis as deducing the fetishistic semblance of simple circulation from the development of the commodity into money in their common ground of abstract labor. Now, by refusing to see the critical intent already inherent in Marx's very first allegedly innocuous analysis, that of the commodity, the commentators mentioned above become unwitting accomplices to an ideological approach. legitimizing the sphere of appearance of capital. See, this is a, kind of a regress problem, perhaps. 1.3.2, the forensic investigation of political economy presupposing totality. The reason for the ideological predicament of some approaches in value form theory, hence, lies in the ignorance of the fact that already at the stage of value form analysis, as mentioned earlier, the totality of capital, the whole system of bourgeois production, is presupposed. That is, the exchange between 20 yards of linen and one coat does not denote a simple exchange, but the most abstract sphere of bourgeois self-presentation. Consequently, the real and by no means simple requirements which already have to be fulfilled so that simple circulation can appear as the paradigmatic form of capitalist intercourse and exchange value can appear as a simple, presuppositionless economic form do not immediately present themselves from an examination of the simple circulation, but lie behind it as economic relations enclosed in the division of labor. Like investors in a criminal case, we must therefore reconstruct the sphere of simple circulation from what lies behind it. What is forgotten in the examination of simple circulation, on the one hand, is the objective basis of the whole system of production. That it is not autonomous individuals who meet on the market to exchange their respective goods, but a relation that already in itself implies compulsion over the individual, in which the individual is entirely determined by society. That this further presupposes a division of labor in which the individual is already posited in relations other than that of mere exchanger. Mainly, the presentations of simple exchange at the point of departure of the analysis of capitalist exchange relations does itself convey a critical intent in that it prepares the re-examination of the formal validity of the law of equivalent exchange in the case of capital and wage labor. It is therefore both presupposed and overlooked, obliterated, in the formal characteristics of simple circulation. Quote, what is overlooked, finally, is that already the simple forms of exchange value and of money latently contain the opposition between labor and capital, etc. Thus, what all this wisdom comes down to is the attempt to stick fast to the simplest economic relations, which, conceived by themselves, are pure abstractions. But these relations are, in reality, mediated by the deepest antithesis and represent only one side in which the full expression of the antithesis, that is, between labor and capital, is obscured. Close quote. Elsewhere, we have already shown that the methodological assumptions in Marx's critique of capital owe to Hegel's method of constituting the object through the interrelation of its parts at the level of the logic of reflection. The totality presupposed for developing the categories from the poorest, that is being/nothingness, to the richest, the concept, the idea, note, right? This is Hegel completely, is therefore constitutive to the object, a totality understood as over-grasping subjectivity. It must therefore begin with mere semblance with what is untrue. This also means that the independence and immediate truth of the categories will show themselves to be wrongly assumed. Being and nothingness are absolutely mediated categories that cannot be meaningfully determined when their purity is assumed. Taken in isolation, they cannot account for their own constitution. The same goes for the commodity and the semblance of simple circulation. We are here only confronted with a distorted version of truth. The deeply problematic truth of capital can only be elucidated as a complete critique of its constitutive categories, that of political economy. It is therefore all the more strange that Marxist authors claim that Hegel started from the premise of presuppositionlessness. The contrary is actually true. In Hegel's, like in Marx's presentation, the development of the idea deliberately begins from a completely mediated nexus that, in the beginning, must show itself to be wrong precisely by taking the categories in isolation, without presupposition in the manner of outer reflection. One must even concede that in the bourgeois economists, like the philosophers Hegel criticized, we must, of course, think of Kant, Precisely because their own categories were conceptualized as unrelated, they were contradictory. We must here return to the question of form. In chapter 1.1, we have already sketched the function of form analysis as the specific method that reveals the obliterated genetic construction of the conventional categories or forms, i.e., money, capital, wage, profit, rent, etc., in their form. Marx's impetus is very Hegelian here. His concept of form coincides with Hegel's concept of the concept, mainly in that it resolutely rejects a mere formal understanding of form. Let me break here and say, this is the fundamental misunderstanding of the analysis of value form. But anyway, back to the text. The concept of overgrasping subjectivity, that is mediation, entails a concept of form as form-content, Formgehalt, which no longer stands in opposition to the content or substance it designates. This is moving forward, right? The object of investigation, the social form of labor that generates the capital relation, is given as processual total structure of economic forms and changes of form, Formwechsel, whose inner chord presents the universal commonality to all particular forms labor assumes as an overgrasping relation. Now, this is no easy task because the form determinations only exist as moments of the total nexus. Marx and we as his readers must position ourselves as the, yes, criminal investigators of political economy who reconstruct the nexus from its mere and sometimes outright inverted appearance. The general nexus of the totality of forms is therefore simultaneously the content of this process, and in this sense, form is also content. See, this is that container problem and the congealment problem all at once. Any analysis that proclaims a systematic, a scientific approach must therefore account for the mutual overturning, the umschlagen of form into content and content into form. Let us see how this understanding can be made fruitful for a precise view of the critical functions of value form analysis. One point three, the functions of value form analysis. Generally speaking, the foremost function of the analysis of the value form is the critique of fetishism of the bourgeois relations of production. In the analysis of the value form, Marx confronts this fetishism on different levels of abstraction. A, in a logical, systematic reconstruction of the transition from the sphere of simple circulation as the abstract and ideological sphere of bourgeois production to the actual basis of that mode of production. B, in a theory of value constitution through the analysis of form and content of the universal equivalent that appears as money form against pre-monetary theories of value. And C, in the demonstration of the law of value in terms of a successive detachment from the intentions, wants, and personal desires of the owners of commodities as a law of a autonomization. We've already covered A in the previous analysis of the commodity as a mediation of totality in which the confrontation between capital and labor is obscured. In the following, for reasons of space, our evaluation of some approaches in value form theory has to limit itself to B, that is the theory of value constitution. The deduction of the value form of money from the semblance of the simple exchange of commodities to its constitutive content in human labor in the abstract does not mean that the form of value is arbitrary or even dispensable. To the contrary, value has its necessary form of appearance in money. In other words, in its palpable, material, objective, and therefore fetishized form, value has no other existence than in money. Yet this does not mean that it is money. It must, however, appear as such. In forms 2 through 4 of value form analysis, Marx has shown that money as the universal equivalent is the specific form in which value functions as the synthesis of the mediation of private labors in a social context. However, the relation of content or substance, that is, human labor in the abstract, and form is not exhausted into a simplistic antagonism between essence and appearance. Essence must appear in the Hegelian sense, but in a form in which its own fetishistic obliterations can still be identified as such. The analysis of the form must therefore identify the content that grounds the form in the form itself against its semblance and make it appear. This is the case when the legitimization strategies of simple circulation become entangled in self-contradictions. And this only happens when money is treated as an entity external to the exchange process, a mere means of the facilitation of exchange as means of circulation. However, money as the palpable form of abstract labor then is the conditio sine qua non of general social exchange, so that theories that suggest the dispensability of money in order to realize equal exchange contradict their own premises, the problem of making it rain. But while the specific content is indicative of a specific form, the reverse is also true. The form must indicate a specific content. Saying that there is no such thing as value without a general equivalent implies that only in the equivalent form, the real reduction of different labors to abstract-general human labor is always already posited. Value form analysis, therefore, also entails the theory of the constitution of value. This is already clear in the specificity of the simple form of value, that is, X commodity A equals Y commodity B, that consists in its polarity, i.e., not merely indicating a reversible relation, but mutually exclusive function, and that, as such, indicates a specific content of the equivalent form. That is, in it, no specific concrete human labor, but human labor in the abstract is the ground or content that enables all the specific and concrete labors to mirror themselves in it, to stand in for it. Kind of explains pornography. Money, therefore, has the double function of representing all the commodities, but none of them specifically. As a thing, it therefore represents human labor in the abstract, all labors, but none of them in particular. This is indeed the joint contribution of the whole world of commodities. In this context, the proposition that Marx's analysis prematurely introduced a posited ground for value in labor becomes meaningless. The requirement of the forms of value to be studied first, quote unquote, is equally absurd. The forms of value are not self-explanatory, much, Kant would say otherwise. A method that hypothesizes the forms of value instead of analyzing them in order to reveal their obfuscated content sticks fast to the simplest economic relations. Value as a social totality can never be constituted in a mere formwechsel of CMC or MCM. The forms of circulation and exchange can never constitute economic objectivity. Simple circulation is not the autonomous sphere of the economic constitution of objectivity. As such, it exists only in the ideological semblance of legitimation of bourgeois self-interpretation. They are the mere illusory forms with regard to the real basis of value constitution in the real subsumption of labor under capitals, like, talking about the free market. We can already become witness to this in the contradictions in the general formula in chapters 5 and 6 of Capital, Volume 1. The Marxian authors we've discussed above, whose impetus lies in distancing themselves from traditional, i.e., embodied labor theories of value, have overstated their case by resorting to formalistic theories of value that are at best tautological, like the theories of the classic, which they do not even consider, and at worst, an uncanny invitation of marginalist assumptions into Marxian theory. However, Marx's labor theory of value was designed as an antidote to these views. The social form of labor, whose economic form character has been overlooked by traditionalists and their opponents alike, indeed surpasses the problematic of a mere antagonism between form and substance to open the horizon for a fundamental critique of the real semblance, the fetishism of capitalist self-presentation. With these preliminary remarks on the problematic that value without fetish this book addresses, we can return to Uno Coso's method and object regarding political economy as a science. Method thus forms the first and object the second and longer part of the book. In the following chapter 2, with which the first part on method closes, we will elaborate the specific ways Uno attempted to access the problem of the logic and the history and its presentation in Marx's Capital. In the chapter, we will critically deal with Uno's Sandankairon, or the three-level method or approach to political economy. Against its claim to provide the missing link or linkage between the logic and the history of capital, we will show that the three-level method remains external to its object, failing to account for both its own constitution and the relation to the objects that it addresses. This is chapter 2.1. Our investigation into the limits of the three-level method will also lead us to question Uno's interpretation of primitive accumulation and its systematic locus at the end of Volume 1 of Capital. Because Uno's method is situated around two important claims, we will highlight the two methodological axes of pure theory, or Ganriron, that Uno identifies for his own specific approach to political economy. On the one hand, the law of population discussed in chapter 2.2 and the commodification of labor power on the other discussed in chapter 2.3. Both axes, while intricately linked, significantly form the vantage point for Uno's analysis of capital and will therefore be scrutinized and criticized in detail. We will show that the axes forming the coordinate system of Uno's approach do not only not adequately reproduce the Problemstellung of Marx's own analysis, but that Uno's particular angle even eliminates Marx's own critical analysis of accumulation crisis and the reproduction of labor power under conditions of unequal exchange. With the general evaluation of Uno's methodological approach to capital as the subject of political economy, we can now turn in more detail to the question of value in chapter 3, Uno's theory of value without fetish, introducing the second part of the book. A close analysis of Uno's 1947 monograph, Value Theory, Kachiron, forms the center of this chapter. The specific focus is Uno's interpretation of value form analysis in section 3 of the first chapter of Capital, the book. Uno's view of abstract labor as a particular form of concrete labor to be discussed in chapter 3.1, and his theory of value derived from the want of the commodity owner in the relative form of value, introducing the motive of methodological individualism in chapter 3.2, will be critically reflected, as well as his theory of money that we find remaining in the framework of Samuel Bailey's nominalist theory of money, chapter 3.3. This chapter will also recur to Uno's view of capital as M-C-M prime, all capitals, that is capital M dash capital C dash capital M prime. Capital as pure form and its exclusion of the specific form of capitalist wage labor from this pure form, relocating the pure form of capital to merchant capital instead, chapter 3.4. Chapter 4, the longest chapter, will finally address Uno's theory of pure capitalism in his main work, Principles of Political Economy, 1950 to 52 and 1964 revised. Here, Uno's three great laws of political economy, the law of value, the law of population, and the law of the equalization of the rate of profit, will be taken up and addressed in different contexts as they appear in this work. The chapter will first provide a summary of the reconstruction of capital, the book, chapter 4.1, that is also indicative of the content with which Uno, in contrast to Marx, chooses to present his pure theory. For example, by directly subsuming the general law of capitalist accumulation, Chapter 25 of Capital Volume 1, to the reproduction schemas of Capital Volume 2, Uno both dislocates and problematically realigns the specific locus, and explanatory function each respective theorem has in Marx's architecture. This move, however, allows Uno to formulate his law of value as the law of general social equilibrium, Chapter 4.2, which we reject and directly confront with Marx's law of value as the law of crisis in Chapter 4.4. It is, however, not without Uno's own view of the nexus between values and prices, contrasting it with Marx's critique of the fetishistic forms of profit and price, that the radical opposition between Uno's approach and Marx's approach to political economy, the first as the internal dream or fantasy of capital, the second as its critique, becomes fully transparent. The question of surplus value and profit, the transformation problem in Uno's perspective, Chapter 4.3, therefore provides the link to the closing assessment of the disparity between Uno and Marx that is not only indicative of a contrasting interest in the theory of capital, but also of a disparate objective. While Marx's intent was to disclose the fetishistic forms that obscure the actual workings of the capital relation, both in its agents and theorists, in order to pave the way for its overcoming, Uno contents himself with reproducing this fetishistic sphere itself, often digressing to the framework of classical and vulgar economists and their form-theoretical, but never form-analytical impetus. This is a very important distinction. Because Uno's work has received a vivid reception both in Japan and internationally, which even accompanied the formation of his own quote-unquote school, Chapter 5 will discuss Uno's legacy in Japan and beyond. This is why I've tacked that on to the end. Needless to say, another 500-page book can be written about the reception of Uno's value theory in Japan alone, which is why we limit ourselves to the line of reception in Japan that is most articulated in accentuating Uno's theory of value in relation to his theory of money, radicalizing the monetary approach lurking but not autonomously formulated in Uno's writing. This is an important point. We identify a post-Uno school of value theory in Japan that, while being critical of Uno, is also considerably informed by his major theoretical interventions, while also drawing on the works of proponents of the Neue Marx-Lektur. Here will therefore be also the place to direct some points of critique to proponents, Hans-Georg Backhaus and Michael Heinrich. A critical discussion of two authors of the post-Uno school, that is, Ebitsuka Akira and Mukai Kimitoshi, will be presented in Money versus Value, the Monetary Approach in the Post-Uno School of Value Theory, Chapter 5.1, delineating the trajectory Uno's work has taken in Japan. From here, we move to Uno's Anglo-American reception, which arguably presents the internationally best-known line of the reception of Uno's work to a non-Japanese-speaking audience. In the Dialectic of Capital, as the apologetic of capital in the Anglophone Uno School, Chapter 5.2, we engage with the works of Uno's student, Thomas T. Sekine. Although his translation work, arguably the founder of the Uno School in the West, and Robert Albritton, who was the first proponent of the Uno School, not to read Uno in the original, darn Canadians. Sekine's work, though time and again emphasizing capital as a dialectical logic, is predominantly found to propose a linear approach to capital as an object of investigation, consequently culminating in an equilibrium theory of price, which we've already problematized in Chapter 4.2 in relation to Uno. Albritton's work will be reflected against the disparity or gap that cannot be filled by virtue of its own theoretical claim. Now, this allows us to identify the specific marks that Uno's work has directly left on theories of capital in mostly English-speaking countries. As a further remove, in the final chapter, Chapter 5.3, we will question some recent historiographies of Japan that have been more or less directly influenced by Uno, but have attempted to form their own approaches, most notably in relation to the question of real subsumption. in The Meaning of Real Subsumption, or The Real Subsumption of Meaning, Aspects of Anglophone Uno School Historiographies, Chapter 5.3, the works of Harry Hartunian and Gavin Walker, who have both recently published remarkable monographs on Japan's specific historical trajectory, and Uno's view of it will be our topic of interest. Here will also be the place to return to the overarching theoretical problem that we've identified as use-value fetishism in Uno's own work. Both Hartunian and Walker share a common theoretical basis that informs their respective interventions, that is, the disavowal of value as the organizing principle of modern capitalist social relations, and by the same token, the hypostatization of the use value aspect of the commodity form as the positive aspect, which allows us to either denounce real subsumption in favor of formal subsumption, Hartunian, or even as site of resistance to capital, Walker, precisely by disavowing the status of value from Marx's critique, or eliminating the critical object of the critique of political economy altogether. We believe that both approaches, faithful to Uno's core theoretical emphasis of use value against value, provide both theoretically and empirically counterfactual and politically questionable explanatory attempts for the global rise of capital. By choosing to ignore the nexus between value and fetish, the theorists in Uno's vein, like Uno before them, do not only leave the problem of fetishism intact, they reproduce it on a higher scale. So this is sort of a natural result, and you can cleave from that other perhaps negative examples or problematic examples, but yet in their negation, I think are really useful for, moving further along. This book is written for the people who continue to question the predicament that is capital. Capital not as a fact, as mere object, but as something that draws and lives on the lifeblood of those who foster capital's own fetishisms and the manifold strategies of its self-legitimization. The true challenge, as we are aware, is still ahead. This book hopes to blow a breach for those willing to take upon themselves this almost irresolvable task. Irresolvable, it shall not remain. Anyway, now note that that's the end of chapter 1, and you can see there's a lot of promise in the remaining chapters, although you can see how she sets up her argument and does a pretty good job of at least setting up the overall outline to the book. Now, without plowing through chapters 2, 3, and 4, I think there's a fundamental point, and the fundamental point is, as I've culled from this, without reducing it too much, the concept of real subsumption as a critical theory of the appropriation of unpaid and alien surplus labor. So the key point of all of this, arm waving, is to ask certain questions about the problem of things that are less accountable for, right? Things that, that the unpaid labor problem that we continually sort of address, and taking a few notes from a particularly Japanese approach to the problem, and not claiming any dominance of one or the other kind of point of view, we sort of set it into its critical framework, which is important relative to the understanding in the 21st century of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Chapter 5, Uno's Legacy in Japan and Beyond. And I'll go through this, for another 15 minutes or so, and then stop as I'm supposed to. So, and we'll continue that on perhaps on Monday. Chapter 5, Uno's Legacy in Japan and Beyond. There are always two principles confronting each other, the abstract and the concrete, the universal and the singular, the dead and the living, das Tote und das Lebendige, the identical and the non-identical, exchange value and use value, capital and labor. The bad childism associated with a theory of revolution has shown itself in the simple aggregation of one side of these conceptual couplets as the untrue whole, and the other side as the principle of hope, or even more simply, as evil and good. Thus, the significant content of each of these concepts had in the Hegelian and Marxian dialectic at their specific place of mediation was necessarily lost. And it is here that the real crisis of the theory of revolution consists, that is, in its fragmentation. I'll say Sonderfallen into, on the one hand, an apocalyptic conjuring of doom, and into an indefatigable faith in the good on the other. Now, that's Hofner in 1993. What is the, close quote, what is the legacy of Uno's thought in the present discourse on value, capital, history, and the social forms they present? This chapter will evaluate the problems elucidated with regard to Uno's pure theory and the theoretical spectrum developed to such diverse areas of research as the post-Uno school of value theory in Japan, 5.1, the Anglophone Uno school, as in Thomas T. Sekenne's and Robert Albritton's work, 5.2, and aspects of Uno-affiliated historiographies in the Anglophone world today, probably best represented in recent works by Harry Hartunian and Gavin Walker, 5.3. Despite their different theoretical interests and incentives to utilize Uno's theory for their respective views of value, money, form of production, history, and the question of resistance to capital, they share a common theoretical basis that informs their respective interventions. The disavowal of value as the organizing principle of modern capitalist social relations, and by the same token, the hypostatization of the use value aspect of the commodity school as the motivator of capitalist exchange relations in the post-Uno school of value theory, or even a site of resistance to capital, as Walker points out. Whether the use value aspect is used affirmatively in the sense that it serves as the expression of exchange relations against the social form of value, or affirmatively in the sense that it provides apparatuses, Walker, that resist alleged teleological determinate agendas of capitalism, Hartunian, both share an indebtedness to Uno's theoretical framework we have previously problematized as use-value fetishism. This chapter will scrutinize the career of the use-value fetishistic aspects in Uno's theory in the more recent international scholarship. Even after the demise of the influential Uno school in the 1980s, Japanese economists have been continuously engaged in the categorical reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy, especially the theory of value and money. Writing in the 1980s to 2000s, authors like Ebizuka Akira, Mukai Kimitoshi, Masaki Hashiro, Kataoka Koji, Umezawa Naoki, and others broaden the value theoretical views of Uno school orthodoxy to include the Neue Marx-Lektüre, the German new reading of Marx, French structuralism, the economists C. Benetti and J. Cartelier, and the regulation school M. Ageleta, and other approaches. However, the integration of more internationally diverse scholarship notwithstanding, the recent value theoretical debates in Japan remain heavily influenced by Uno's idiosyncratic reinterpretation of Marx's Capital, the book. In his reconstructive reading, stretching from his works on value, that is the Kachiran of 1947, to his better-known Principles of Political Economy, the Kaizai Gunran in 1950 or 1964, Uno, as we've seen, strongly criticizes Marx's derivation of money from the analysis of the commodity and the labor theory of value. This is the major problematic. Chapter 5.1 will review not only the remaining influence of Uno on the newer Japanese readings of Capital, but also confront a reading that poses what we believe is a false opposition of money and value in Marx's critique of political economy. This view is perpetuated by Ibitsuka Akira and Mukai Kimitoshi's appropriation of the monetary approach of Benetti Cartelier on the one hand, and Hans-Georg Barkhaus's and Michael Heinrich's monetary theory of value on the other, leading them to discard the labor theory of value in favor of a money-only approach. And you can see how this would relate to things going on in the other spheres. While we will problematize the appropriation of Backhaus and Heinrich for this strategy, we will show that the dismissal of value theory leads to a reinterpretation of Marx's critique of the capitalist relations of production as a Baileyan, Samuel Bailey, apologetics of the same, a position which we believe is both theoretically and practically precarious. Chapter 5.2 will question the equilibrium approach to capitalist reproduction already found in Uno and resuscitated in Sekin's work. In it, Sekin's critique of non-equilibrium approaches to capitalist economy, especially Duncan Foley et al.'s new interpretation, will receive a fundamental counter-criticism, reinstalling the centrality of Marx's labor theory of value as the core critical theorem and heuristic of capitalist relations and their bourgeois interpretation. In the same vein, Sekin's view of the law of value as a law of general equilibrium will be shown to stem from an apologetic view of capitalist relations of production. A similar apologetic view of capital is repeated in Albritton's approach to Uno's stages theory. Not only does Albritton adapt the view of the law of value as the sustenance of an ideal balancing between supply and demand, thereby introducing the idea that essentially capital produces use values to guarantee general social reproduction, eschewing the problem of moneyed demand, and therefore that of capitalism's specificity. But he focuses on the problem between the logic and the history of capitalist development that he finds solved in Uno's theory of stages. In it, the level of pure theory corresponds to the equilibrium force of the law of value in the realm of ideal use values, while the level of the concrete historical is reflected in key developmental stages of capitalism, as there are the stages of mercantilism, that is merchant capital, liberalism, industrial capital, and the stage or era of imperialism, finance capital. However, as we will argue, Albritton's insistence on the methodological separation of stages theory on the one hand and the alleged purity of the principles of capitalist logic on the other do not constitute an organic whole, but remain external to one another, leaving the claim of a meaningful reconciliation of the logic and history of capital wanting, and, as we will see, tautological. More importantly, however, Albritton, like Uno, fails to acknowledge the epistemological status of value in that, as a real abstraction, it does not describe an ideal or hypothetic assumption about the organization of the capitalist mode of production, but its actual implementation and contradictory effects, including the problem of economic crisis absent from Albritton as well as Uno's theorization. The methodological objection and resentment against demonstrating the intrinsically devastating effects of the law of value, or rather surplus value, in a real historical situation, which was Marx's incentive for his illustrations of capital, bears a significant symptom of the inherently apologetic character of Albritton's contribution. I see that I have intervened on something that we had scheduled. Let me stop now, and we will continue this on Monday. Thank you very much for your attention.